Justice Amy Coney Barrett tried to make an example out of Jasmine Crockett, using power to crush resistance. But when the cameras kept rolling and the truth went viral, it wasn't Jasmine who was left answering for her actions. It was the judge herself. Jasmine Crockett had dealt with pressure before, from tense committee hearings to national interviews. She was no stranger to confrontation. But this felt different. It was a Monday morning when the envelope landed on her desk in D.C. A thick, official-looking document with a gold seal stamped across the front. At first glance, she thought it was a formality. Maybe another request to speak on policy or ethics. But as she flipped through the pages, her expression tightened. It was a subpoena. And not just any subpoena. She was being summoned to testify in a federal case involving potential misconduct within the House. The documents were vague, deliberately so. What stood out was who was overseeing the hearing. Justice Amy Coney Barrett. Jasmine reread the name, blinking in disbelief. Since when did a sitting Supreme Court justice preside over a federal inquiry involving a member of Congress? It wasn't standard, not by a long shot. Jasmine felt her stomach twist. This wasn't just about testimony. This felt like a setup. Jasmine didn't wait. She called her legal advisor, a former prosecutor with a sharp eye for hidden agendas. "They're reaching, Jasmine," he said flatly. "It's not illegal to subpoena you, but the optics, the fact that they've placed Barrett on this, they want to make an example out of someone, and you've got a loud enough voice to fit the bill." "I'm not backing down," Jasmine replied. Pacing her office, "They're going to hear me, and I'm not about to walk into that room playing quiet. Not for anyone. You won't be alone," he said, "but keep your composure. You know how they spin these things." That Wednesday, Jasmine flew out for the hearing. Reporters were already gathering outside the courthouse. When she arrived, cameras trained on her every move. Dressed in a clean-cut navy pantsuit, her signature curls framing her determined face, Jasmine walked through the entrance with her head high and her heart steady inside. The courtroom was colder than she expected, sterile and quiet with whispers bouncing off the marble walls. She took her seat at the designated witness table, flanked by her legal counsel, and waited. Then the doors opened and Amy Coney Barrett entered. Robed and expressionless, their eyes met briefly. No words were exchanged, but Jasmine caught it. A flicker of recognition, maybe even challenge in Barrett's glance. The room stood as Barrett took her seat. "We are here today to gather testimony relevant to case number 24 FR 2825. Barrett began, her voice firm and clipped. "This is a federal proceeding. Any disruption, defiance, or deviation from protocol will not be tolerated." Jasmine didn't blink. She sat still, hands folded. Barrett's tone made it clear this wasn't about truth. It was about control. As the hearing began, the prosecution started with what appeared to be routine questions. Until they weren't, they veered into Jasmine's past public statements, her positions on controversial bills, even her tweets. "This has nothing to do with the case," Jasmine finally said, not bothering to mask her irritation. "I was called to testify on a matter of oversight. Not my politics. The witness will not speak out of turn." Barrett snapped. Jasmine leaned in slightly. "With all due respect, I will not be used as a political punching bag in a courtroom. If there's a charge, name it. If not, let's stop pretending this is justice." The room fell quiet. Barrett paused. Lips tight, let the record show that the witness has been warned. But Jasmine wasn't intimidated. She could feel what was coming, and she wasn't going to run from it. Outside the courthouse, the buzz grew. Social media was already lighting up. A clip of Jasmine challenging Barrett mid-hearing had gone viral. Within minutes, people were watching. And Jasmine knew this wasn't just her fight anymore. It had just begun by the second day of the hearing. The weight of the moment had settled in. Jasmine Crockett arrived at the courthouse before sunrise, avoiding the media frenzy that had swelled since her first appearance. Her phone buzzed nonstop messages of support. Concern and curiosity flooded in. But she ignored them all. Today wasn't about reactions. It was about what was waiting behind those heavy wooden doors. Inside the courtroom, the mood was sharper, tighter. Everyone felt it. Barrett sat elevated behind the bench, her expression unreadable. Her robe draped perfectly, posture straight. She had made no public comment since yesterday's tension, but she didn't need to. Her silence spoke loud enough. Jasmine sat down, calm but alert. Her attorney leaned in quietly. "They're going to bait you today," he whispered. "Don't let them." "I won't," she replied. "But I'm not walking on eggshells either." The hearing resumed. Prosecutors moved quickly. Too quickly, they introduced new lines of questioning. completely unrelated to the core of the case. Jasmine's past advocacy work, community protests she had attended, even fundraisers. It wasn't a hearing. It was an interrogation, Congresswoman Crockett, one prosecutor said, holding up a printout of a speech she gave the year before. Do you still believe that the justice system is inherently political? I said it then and I'll say it now. Jasmine answered, there are parts of it that are, and this courtroom is proving it. Boebert's gavel struck the bench sharply. You will answer the questions directly and without commentary. I am answering directly, you just don't like the answer. Jasmine said, her tone steady. There was a shift in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but subtle, a low murmuring among the onlookers. The bailiff gave a warning glance toward the gallery. Boebert locked eyes with Jasmine. If you continue to speak out of order, I will hold you in contempt. Jasmine exhaled slowly through her nose. This wasn't about evidence. It was about power who could keep control, and she knew it wasn't going to stop here. The next exchange crossed the line. The prosecution introduced an exhibit, a social media post Jasmine had liked 3 years ago. Taken wildly out of context, it was a criticism of a ruling Boebert had authored. Before joining the Supreme Court, they projected it on the courtroom screen, like it was classified material. Jasmine blinked in disbelief. You're seriously putting up something I liked online? Years before this hearing even existed. The post speaks to your state of mind. The prosecutor replied, your bias against the court. I'm not on trial, she said. But if I were, you'd be failing to prove anything real. Boebert didn't wait this time. Congresswoman Crockett, this is your final warning. If you continue to disrupt or respond, because those aren't the same thing. And you know that Boebert's jaw clenched. She reached for the gavel again, but paused, seeming to reconsider for just a moment. Then she looked to the prosecutor. Please proceed with the next question. The rest of the hearing blurred together. Questions meant to provoke, answers meant to defend, but Jasmine held her ground. Never shouting, never storming out. Just presence, strength, firmness. But everyone in that room knew this wasn't over. Boebert was a symbol, Crockett had become one too, and now they were on a collision course. As the session adjourned, Jasmine stood to leave. But before she took 2 steps, Boebert spoke again. Congresswoman Crockett. A moment Jasmine turned. Raising an eyebrow, you will return tomorrow? And I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach. This court does not tolerate showmanship. Jasmine nodded slowly. Neither do the people watching from home. She walked out without another word. Outside, the crowd had tripled. Microphones were waiting, supporters held signs. Some with her face, some with phrases like, let her speak. Jasmine didn't stop. For them, she didn't need to. This fight wasn't about winning a soundbite. It was about surviving the storm without bending, and the storm was just starting to form. By the 3rd day, the hearing felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a boiling point waiting to erupt. Jasmine Crockett knew it, so did her legal team. And most importantly, so did Judge Boebert. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Jasmine entered the room. The energy was thick, like the kind of silence that comes before a loud crack of thunder. Even the guards seemed more rigid, standing a little straighter. The prosecutors looked sharper, hungrier. They weren't just trying to discredit Jasmine anymore. They wanted to humiliate her. Judge Boebert didn't acknowledge her as she entered. Not even a glance. She adjusted the files before her and called the session to order. This court is prepared to resume testimony, she said plainly. The witness will take the stand. Jasmine rose and walked with purpose to the front. Her heels clicked across the floor, steady and deliberate. She wasn't here to entertain, and she wasn't here to fold. The prosecutor stood. Let's return to the issue of public trust, Congresswoman. Jasmine nodded, not flinching. You've publicly questioned the impartiality of the judicial system. In your own words, you said, there are people in power who hide behind procedure when they feel threatened by truth. Were you referring to this court? No, Jasmine said. But it seems like it applies. There were a few quiet gasps in the gallery. The prosecutor looked at Boebert, who showed no reaction yet, Congresswoman. The prosecutor said, pushing forward, would you agree that your refusal to answer directly, your combative tone, and your willingness to undermine the authority of this bench show a blatant disregard for due process? Jasmine leaned slightly forward. What I refuse is to sit here and pretend that what's happening is fair. This isn't about justice, it's about optics. Boebert's voice cut through the air. That's enough. Jasmine turned her attention toward her with respect. It's not because while we're sitting here in this courtroom, being told what we can and can't say, There are real people out there who are watching and learning exactly what this system does. To voices it can't control, Barrett's tone shifted cold final. Congresswoman Crockett, this is your last interruption. If you speak again out of turn, I will exercise my authority and hold you in contempt. I suggest you choose your words more carefully. That was the moment, the one that changed everything. Jasmine's attorney touched her arm lightly, trying to cool things down. But she shook him off calmly. I was raised to speak when something isn't right. She said, not when it's convenient, not when it's allowed, when it matters. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Judge Boebert stared at her. There was no hesitation in her next move. This court finds the witness in contempt. She said, remove her. A stunned murmur broke out in the gallery. You're serious, Jasmine asked. Standing up slowly, you've repeatedly disrespected the authority of this court. No, Jasmine replied. I've disrespected the abuse of it. And I'll do it again if it means telling the truth. The bailiffs approached unsure for a moment. Jasmine didn't resist. She simply looked at Boebert and said, you'll regret this not as a threat, but as a promise, because outside those courtroom walls, something had started. Clips of the confrontation were already flooding social media. Lawmakers were speaking out. Lawyers were questioning the legality of what just happened. People who'd never even heard Jasmine's name were now sharing her face with words like bravery and targeted. And all of it every second was being watched as Jasmine was escorted out. She didn't hang her head. She kept her posture upright, eyes forward even as flashbulbs popped and reporters shouted her name. Because somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't her defeat. It was the beginning of a backlash that no robe could silence. The air outside the courthouse felt different now, charged, unpredictable. Jasmine Crockett hadn't even made it to the transport vehicle before reporters began shouting questions. Congresswoman, did you expect to be detained today? Do you feel you were treated fairly by Justice Boebert? Is this political retaliation? She didn't respond, not yet. She kept walking inside the building. Her legal team was already scrambling. They hadn't anticipated. Boebert would go as far as ordering her removed. Silencing a sitting member of Congress under such thin justification wasn't just irregular, it was explosive. By the time Jasmine was formally booked for contempt of court, social media was in overdrive. The clip of her saying, "You'll regret this," had already been posted 1,000 times with 1,000 different captions. But not all reactions were the same. Some were outraged, others predictably accused her of grandstanding. But the more thoughtful voices were asking a different question. Why was this happening at all? Back inside the courthouse, things weren't going as smoothly for Boebert. Within hours, Bose's 2 former federal judges had issued public statements, questioning the appropriateness of a Supreme Court justice, presiding over a politically charged hearing. With such overt disciplinary action, one headline read, "Is Justice Boebert crossing a constitutional line?" That night, while Jasmine sat in a holding room awaiting her legal review, her team filed an emergency motion. They cited procedural overreach, a lack of due process, and abuse of judicial discretion. The motion didn't mince words. This is not about courtroom conduct. This is about silencing dissent, about leveraging the highest judicial office to intimidate an elected representative who refused to play small. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Calls began pouring into congressional offices. Ordinary citizens voicing support. Even a few lawmakers across the aisle privately reached out, offering quiet encouragement. And then came the video a court stenographer anonymously leaked an extended recording of the hearing uncut. It showed Jasmine's words, her tone, and most importantly, the moment Boebert ordered her held in contempt, without edits or media spin. It painted a picture that was far less disruptive than the official narrative suggested. By morning, the video had millions of views. At sunrise, Jasmine was released on her own recognizance, pending review of the contempt order. Her lawyer met her at the exit. He didn't say anything at first, just nodded as they walked to the waiting car. He finally spoke. They overplayed it. Jasmine smirked, tired but unshaken. "Let's make sure that matters." That afternoon, Jasmine's team filed a motion to vacate the contempt charge. The motion didn't just argue for technical errors. It challenged the integrity of the proceeding itself. It demanded that Boebert recuse herself going forward, citing bias, overreach, and conflict of interest. This wasn't a courtroom chess match anymore. It was a political earthquake. As the motion made its way through the system, Boebert remained silent, no press conference. No comments, no statements. But sources close to the court began to whisper. some clerks uneasy about how fast things had escalated, others privately questioning her judgment. The silence from Boebert wasn't strength. It was strategy, but to Jasmine and her team, it was also confirmation this hadn't been about procedure. It had been about control, about putting her in her place, but that plan had backfired. Because what started as an effort to shame and punish had given Jasmine something far more powerful: national visibility, moral authority, and a growing chorus of support from people who saw what really happened. By the end of the week, protests had formed outside the courthouse. Not massive, but loud enough to make headlines. Signs read, "Let her speak. Power shouldn't silence truth. This is what resistance looks like." The contempt order may have been meant to end the conversation. Instead, it opened a door that couldn't be closed. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak publicly for 48 hours after her release. Not a tweet, not a statement, nothing. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was calculation in the background. Her legal team worked non-stop, building not just a defense, but a case against the very foundation of what had happened. Inside that courtroom, meanwhile, outside the country wasn't waiting. Cable news picked up the story in prime time. Some anchors treated it like a political scandal, others like a cultural moment. But what made it different this time? What made it stick was the footage. That raw, unedited courtroom video. No yelling, no outbursts. Just a black congresswoman calmly asserting her right to speak, and a Supreme Court justice silencing her, under threat of incarceration. That visual didn't sit right with people. It couldn't be spun. The backlash wasn't just political. It was human. Civil rights attorneys took to social media one after the other, calling Boebert's actions unconstitutional. Professors from law schools across the country published short essays overnight, many echoing the same point. Contempt of court is not a tool to control speech. It's a tool to maintain order. And Crockett hadn't disrupted anything. She'd spoken truth to power. And power didn't like it. Even members of Congress, who normally kept their distance from such disputes, were forced to respond. A joint letter from over 30 lawmakers condemned the contempt charge, citing an alarming erosion of respect for elected voices, especially those that challenged tradition and privilege. Behind the scenes, Jasmine's legal team was coordinating something bigger than just clearing her name. They were organizing a formal challenge to Boebert's authority in the case, filing a petition with the Judicial Conference to review her conduct. Quietly, they had also begun preparing testimony from legal experts to speak before a review panel. Should it come to that, and Jasmine, she was watching, listening. Letting it all build, then came the moment at 11:07 a.m. on Monday morning. Jasmine appeared outside the courthouse with her legal team behind her. Cameras snapped rapidly. Reporters jostled for position. She wore all white, deliberate, clean composed. She walked to the podium and took a long breath before speaking. "I want to thank every person who has reached out. Over the past few days, she began, not because this has been easy, but because it's been necessary. What happened inside that courtroom wasn't just about me. It was about how we handle power, how we react when someone refuses to shrink." She paused, eyes locked on the cameras. "I was held in contempt of court not because I broke the law, but because I wouldn't break myself to fit into a system that punishes boldness. From people who look like me, I came to testify. I was ready to speak truth, but I was silenced." Another pause longer. "Judge Boebert may have the bench, but she does not have the final word." The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions, but she didn't take any. She stepped back, nodded to her lawyer, and walked away. That clip alone got over 15 million views within 24 hours. That same evening, the Department of Justice released a brief statement. "We are aware of recent proceedings involving Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. We will be reviewing the conduct and judicial handling of the matter. That wasn't routine, and it wasn't meaningless. It signaled that this wasn't just becoming a public debate. It was entering official channels." Inside the court, Boebert kept her silence. But within legal circles, people whispered about mounting pressure. Rumors began swirling about conversations among Supreme Court aides, and the quiet unease surrounding the justices' continued involvement in the case. By midweek, Crockett's legal team filed their final request, an emergency appeal to vacate the contempt charge, along with a formal motion for Judge Boebert to be disqualified from the hearing due to demonstrated bias and personal interest. The filing ended with one line: "This court was not used to uphold justice, but to punish speech that cannot be allowed to stand. And now, it was up to the system that claimed to protect liberty to prove it still could. The courtroom sat empty the morning the decision came down. Jasmine wasn't there, neither was Judge Boebert. Instead, it was a panel of senior federal judges who quietly reviewed the emergency filings. No cameras, no media fanfare. Just a closed-door review of what had unfolded, and the rules that were broken to make it happen. The ruling dropped just before noon. It was swift, clear, and damning. The contempt order against Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was vacated. In full, the court found that her removal from the hearing had no legal foundation and that her statements, while assertive, did not meet the standard for disruption warranting contempt. More importantly, the panel declared that the decision to silence her had undermined the principle of impartial adjudication and cited deep concern over Judge Boebert's conduct. For the first time, the institution that had tried to silence Jasmine was forced to acknowledge its own overreach. The news swept the nation like wildfire. By 1 p.m., Jasmine's name was trending on every platform. A growing number of lawmakers from both parties began urging a review of the broader case. Boebert had been overseeing. Quiet discussions turned public, as members of the Senate Judiciary Committee demanded answers on how a Supreme Court justice came to oversee a politically charged hearing with no clear jurisdictional basis. Boebert's longtime allies in the legal world, who had praised her composure and restraint for years, began to fall silent. Some issued carefully worded statements distancing themselves. Others simply refused to comment. One former federal judge, speaking anonymously to a reporter, said it plainly. Boebert made it personal. And when a judge makes it personal, they lose the robe if not in law. Then entrust Jasmine, for her part, didn't celebrate that afternoon. She held a brief press conference, not in front of the courthouse this time, but at a small community center in the neighborhood. She had once served as a public defender. She stood before a modest crowd. No prepared statement, no teleprompters. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about what it means when truth becomes a threat, when speaking up is treated like stepping out of line." She looked down for a moment, choosing her next words. "When I was a law student, I learned that contempt of court was supposed to protect order, not power, not ego, and definitely not the comfort of the people at the top. But this week showed us something else, something dangerous that even at the highest levels, the rules can bend to fear. Fear of change, fear of resistance, fear of voices like mine." The room was silent, listening. "But fear doesn't win," she said. "It reacts, it punishes, and it always overreaches." Boebert remained out of sight. No press statements, no appearances. Legal analysts speculated that she was being advised to wait, let the storm pass. But this wasn't a regular media flare-up. It had become something deeper. Within legal circles, debates erupted. Should a sitting Supreme Court justice be allowed to take part in politically sensitive hearings? Should there be new ethical constraints? Could Congress demand oversight? The momentum wasn't just with Jasmine anymore. It was with everyone who had ever been told they were too much, too loud or too unprofessional for standing firm. The story had grown legs reaching law students, organizers, activists, and even everyday people who had never paid attention to a courtroom before. A week later, a congressional subcommittee opened a formal inquiry into the judicial conduct of Boebert. In relation to the hearing, the message was clear. This wasn't over. And for Jasmine Crockett, it never had been about winning a battle in court. It was about refusing to be silenced when speaking mattered most. Because sometimes the law doesn't protect the truth until someone risks everything to make it. Impossible to ignore. It was raining. The day Jasmine Crockett returned to the steps of the courthouse, not as a witness, not as a target, but as a woman who had refused to be diminished. The skies were gray, steady drops falling as if the city itself were pausing to listen. Reporters stood huddled beneath umbrellas. Supporters lined the sidewalk, holding handmade signs that had nothing to do with party lines. They weren't about politics anymore. They were about what Jasmine had come to represent. She stood beneath the courthouse awning, water streaking down the marble behind her. And for the first time since the incident, she didn't come with lawyers flanking her or aides whispering behind the scenes. She stood alone deliberately. "I've spent the last few weeks thinking about silence." She began her voice even and measured the rain, lightly tapping at her microphone, about how it's used as a tool, how it's demanded, expected, and enforced, especially when someone like me decides not to sit quietly and nod. She took a breath. "This didn't start because I broke a rule. It started because I didn't break." There was no need to raise her voice. The tension came not from her volume, but from the calm precision of every word. She wasn't angry, she was resolved. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just a legal overreach. It was a warning, a message not just to me, but to anyone who dares to speak plainly in a space not designed for them. But the truth is, this system doesn't get to decide when we speak. A few members of the press attempted to interrupt with questions, but she raised her hand gently. I'll take questions in a minute, but let me say this first. She glanced toward the courthouse doors. There is a cost to refusing to shrink. A real one. It can look like public criticism, like detention, like headlines written to discredit you before your side is even heard. But that cost is nothing compared to the price of silence. I won't pay that, I never will. The crowd clapped softly beneath their umbrellas. It wasn't the loud, roaring kind of applause. It was quiet, respectful, like people knew they were watching something important. She continued, what I experienced wasn't just about courtroom procedure. It was about who gets to speak without being punished for it. And the answer should never depend on race, gender, or political convenience. Jasmine looked out into the crowd, her tone softening. I've heard from people across the country, teachers, students, nurses, factory workers, people I'll never meet, telling me they saw something in what happened to me that reminded them of moments they'd been told to sit down, stay quiet, go along, and to every one of them, I see you. I hear you, and I hope you never fold either. She let the silence hang a moment before she stepped back from the mic. That would have been enough. But then she added almost off script, almost like a whisper meant for the people behind the cameras. They tried to make me regret telling the truth, but the only thing I regret is that so many others still feel they can't. The final camera panned back as Jasmine turned to walk down the courthouse steps. Not rushed, not hiding, just walking. Her words echoed in the broadcast. I won't be silenced, and you shouldn't be either. By that evening, clips of her speech were stitched into montages, reaction videos, and news segments around the globe. The moment had shifted from courtroom controversy to cultural clarity. Jasmine had walked into that courthouse as a witness. She walked out as a warning. To those who thought silencing someone would erase their message, it didn't, it amplified it. If this story moved you, if you believe that power must be held accountable, no matter who wields it, make sure to subscribe. We're telling the stories they don't want heard, and we're just getting started.